Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. Let's give ourselves maybe 30 seconds, for the rest of the attendees to join the webinar. Okay, maybe I'll kickstart with a little bit of an introduction. My name is Gabriel. I'm the Director for Strategic Partnership at APACMed. First of all, I would like to apologize that my camera is not working and I can't unveil myself. Yeah, but we have a great panel today, and I'm really delighted to to engage and participate in the dialogue. So as an introduction, APACMed is a not-for-profit medical technology association representing companies operating in the medical device, the diagnostics, and the digital health space. We lead the efforts to advance medical technologies in order to raise the standards of care for patients. So we are fundamentally a membership-based organization, and if you look at 20 of the top 30 global medtech companies, they are already part of our association. And we also have a growing number of startups, accounting for 49% of our membership base. So given the growth of our startup members, from 1 in 2017 to 93 startups at present, we had this year developed the APACMed Founder Series to help our startups scale up through a few areas. One, through education such as this, through collaboration, and through mentorship. So this webinar series is one such initiative to support the growing startup community. Over the last 6 months, we've covered topics from M&A and partnership, to human-centered design, to clinical trials and strategies, IP, regulatory strategies, and fundraising. Today, our topic is on navigating communication in the startup industry. We are in very challenging times, and for startups to survive and thrive, effective founder and investor communication is imperative. But we all know that expectations do not always match reality. So today we are really delighted to have a panel of investor and communication experts to share how startups can take their founder-investor relationship to new heights. I'll hand this session over to Chris Hardesty, Director for Healthcare and Life Science Practice at Kpmg, to introduce this session and to introduce the panelists. Over to you, Chris.
Great, many thanks, Gabriel, and hello to everyone. I appreciate this opportunity with APACMed to continue to lead the Founders Series. It's a great program. I hope that everyone gets engaged in that. So as Gabriel said, I'm the director of Kpmg's Healthcare and Life Sciences practice based here in Singapore. So working across the Asia Pacific on health transformation programs as well as medical technology innovation programs. So a pleasure to be with you. And I think there's sort of two angles we want to try and drive through today. One is the continued opportunity for impact out there for innovation in the healthcare space, COVID, post-COVID era. So whether you're a big company, a small company, academia, investor, we've got a lot of different constituents on the call today, but how can you make an impact out there? What is the investor view on where the opportunities are? But then secondly, the important role of communications probably is something that is not discussed often enough in this context. And I think that we can all agree, even before COVID, many of the startups or entrepreneurs or innovators, there were some challenges in the way that we communicate their value proposition to the other party and really use communications to succeed. And I think this is even more challenging now because a lot of the communications are being done virtually, or there are borderless competition for whatever you're trying to innovate and pioneer. So that's the other angle that we want to get through today. So I hope that will be quite interesting. And just in terms of the program, so we'll have SPAG talk about a report that they've developed that will be released in October on this topic. So they've actually interviewed investors around the region in healthcare to understand, what they see in innovation and the role of communication. So Priyanka will lead us through that. And then we'll have some discussion. So when I say interaction, I really mean that. I think for people attending today, this is your call. This is your session. So please do put your thoughts in the chat. Your questions, we'll address them as we go. And we've got a lot of prepared discussion topics, but I would much rather engage with you guys and hear what you have to say. So please do that all along the way. If you have questions about the report Priyanka will share, questions for the panelists, let's make it an interactive discussion. And just to sort of introduce everyone you've got here in front of you. So Priyanka, she's the regional head of SPAG. And I believe she was also recently recognized as a top 20 global Indian. So congratulations, Priyanka, on that. Pretty cool. It's a highly competitive space, I think. We've got Grace, who's the lead for communications and digital at SG Innovate. And we've got Mervyn from Quadria Capital. He's a vice president there. And Samant, who's the managing partner at healthtech Capital. So a great mix of investors and communication experts here to engage with you today. And just before we get into the presentation of the report, I'll launch the first poll. I'd like to see how the audience are feeling. Hopefully you can see that in front of you. So in the COVID context, given what we find, where does your organization sit? Whether you're a big company, small company, other in the ecosystem, are you looking at new opportunities? Are you keeping your existing focus? Are you struggling? How are you guys feeling today? A few more seconds. All right, let me share those with you. The percentages were throwing me off. I guess it was multiple choice. Probably should have been single choice. So, but it looks like we've got a fairly optimistic group, which is great to see. So, you know, those who are seeking new opportunities and those who are keeping their pre-COVID focus, of course, those are not mutually exclusive. So you may be well keeping your pre-COVID focus and also seeking new outlets for that innovation. So that's great to see that we're already an optimistic bunch today. All right. Let me stop talking then. And Priyanka, would you like to share the report findings? And again, I encourage the audience, please, if you have questions about the reports, thoughts, put those in the chat. We'll take those. But yeah, we'll just take a few minutes here and hear the findings from SPAG. So Priyanka, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you so much for the introduction. That was Sam. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the session of the APACMed Founder Series. I'm very excited to be part of this program curated by APACMed to give young startups the opportunity to receive support from healthcare industry leaders. My name is Priyanka Bajpayee, and I'm the regional head at SPAG. I'll just give a very brief intro about my company. SPAG is an award-winning independent communications firm with a very strong focus on healthcare and life sciences. Our operations span across Asia Pacific, and SPAG has been very shortly listed in the top 25 PR agencies list 2020 by Exchange for Media. And we have also won the Holmes Report Healthcare PR Consultancy of the Year at the prestigious Sabre Awards Asia Pacific in 2019 last year. Today, before we get on a full-on discussion on this engaging topic, I'll also take this opportunity to present the highlights of our annual Outlook Report 2020, aimed at uncovering communication-backed solutions to help startups garner interest from investors. These insights are derived from first-hand conversations that we've had with key stakeholders, including venture capitalists, angel investors, startup mentors, incubators, accelerators. Next slide, Crystal. Okay, so if we were to look at COVID-19, COVID-19 has definitely upturned the world with business as usual to becoming more business unusual. COVID-19 has also brought with it some boons and with it some challenges for startups, that's given. Healthcare, especially medtech, may be facing an uptick, of course, due to being the need of the hour, with regulatory approvals that have been accelerated because of this. Before COVID-19 happened, approvals could take more than 18 months or even longer. Now, something that didn't exist 6 months ago in biotech and medtech can be pushed to mass production. Interestingly, investors are interested in sectors that can pivot quickly and have proven to be highly relevant during COVID-19, including the tech aspects of healthcare, such as telehealth, and remote monitoring solutions and other sectors, including e-learning, e-commerce, and delivery services. However, one huge problem startups can face during this period is, of course, the networking. Key conferences which gave opportunity to these startups to meet investors, they have been postponed, cancelled, or have even, everybody knows it's gone virtual. It goes both ways, right? Investors have mentioned to us that it is difficult for investors to learn about startups and investment opportunities. And startups, of course, have mentioned losing the live personal connection. As a follow-on point to what I just said, when it is difficult to have real-life conversations, trust gets difficult to build. We're aware that investment decisions are inherently a product of trust. With that missing connect, how do you get investors to buy into your ideas? Next slide. So if I were to build up on what I just said, how do you still make yourself relevant and agile, given that impacts of COVID-19 is here to stay for a while? There's a good news though. Through our conversations, we've discovered that investors typically look at several key points, some which are very obvious, some not so obvious. First and foremost, the team, the founders. This is very important, and I'll tell you why. Majority of investors unanimously said that they were very keenly looking into the team of these startups. They look at the founders' attitude. Do they have the passion and will to overcome obstacles, especially during COVID-19? They also look at their willingness to learn and improve from their failures. Second, the experience. Investors look at previous work experience as well as whether the founders are serial entrepreneurs. Having work prior experience in a startup can prove really advantageous. And of course, the expertise. Investors look at whether the team members' areas of expertise complement each other. Is there someone with a business acumen or with a medical expertise, or in that entire team of people, is there somebody who has the engineering capabilities? All of this matters to a lot of extent for all these investors. The second point, which was really valuable, was the value proposition these investors look into, the business fundamentals of the startup. The value proposition, of course, we all know is the new elevator pitch. Your startup proposition is what will define your business and distinguish you from your competitors. Many startup companies describe themselves as maybe better, faster, cheaper than what's already on the market, and they pitch and say, that isn't enough. How is the solution better? How much faster? How much cheaper than the standard rate of care? You must be prepared to communicate your unique value proposition from all angles, and you need to understand the healthcare economics of each stakeholder. Take the time, and that's very important, that you have to take the time early on to define the standard of care for each of your possible stakeholders, and then maybe quantitatively explain how your product improves upon it. Is it solving a real need? Is there a product fit for the market? And is your startup scalable? All of this is very important. When we were also talking to these investors, what came out as a very obvious thing, but not so obvious again, as I said, is the credibility. Investors look at whether startups are able to back their claims and capabilities with the relevant studies, publications, and clinical trials. The most effective way to build credibility is to relate to your customers. Why and how will your product or your service help them? Most products and services are born out of necessity by the creator. Share that story. Investors want to know that you're credible, as their investment is a reflection on them as well. Next slide. Knowing what investors are looking for isn't enough. And then, of course, that brings us to the topic of how do you communicate what they wish to see. First and foremost, networking, of course, is the key. Plenty of investors we interviewed mentioned that they learn about startups through their professional network, from other VCs, even from startups competitors. Getting referrals is a great way to get an investor. trust is a key component of these referrals here. And I mean, it goes without saying that these people are risking their credibility to refer you as a startup, which is why referrals will get you a foot in the door more easily than cold calling and emailing at random. Get on the right platforms to make those connections and get noticed. There are so many of them today, nowadays. AngelList, Gust, Crunchbase, LinkedIn has been always there. Secondly, I think what's also relevant and is a point of consideration is that startups need to tell their stories effectively. People remember stories more than they remember numbers. We need to understand that. In your pitch, demonstrate clearly what is it you offer that other startups don't. Demonstrate that you understand your competitors. Keep your pitch concise, whether it is your verbal presentation or your pitch deck. In fact, we were talking to these investors who've mentioned that they hate reading 30 to 60 page decks. So the key takeaway here would be your pitch should be concise, crisp, on point, and effective. Startups need to have a planned media strategy as well. They need to be in the media outlets relevant to the startup's business profile. Given that investors place strong value or focus on the team's capabilities, engage in leadership profiling with relevant media outlets, and highlight your team's mission and expertise, of course. Investors also look at whether a startup is a thought leader in its industry area. Opinion articles and news of participations, partnerships, product launches are items they usually observe, and they observe very keenly. Last but not the least, startups need to keep that top of mind recall in investors' and consumers' minds. They need to manage their own channels carefully. If the startup is B2B, LinkedIn is a good platform to post thought leadership articles and news of partnerships. I think LinkedIn has been a great platform. If the startup is B2C, driving growth on consumer-facing platforms like Instagram, Facebook, it's a good way to show investors that customer acquisition and leads are high. Leverage the relevant communication channels and mediums apt for your business rather than exploring all the available digital options. That's the key. Having said that, of course, these were few of the findings that we found were very not only intriguing, catchy, came out more than multiple number of times when we were conversing. So I'll leave it up to here. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the curtain raiser for our report. Do catch it on our website and social media when we launch the report in late October 2020. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a question in the Q&A box. Over to you, Chris. I think I was within the time frame.
Yes, thank you, Priyanka. Very good. And I hope everyone's excited to see the full report and a very unique kind of inside look at the investor mindset during these times. So thanks for that. I think we'll get the kind of panelists going here now and we can foster some discussion, but maybe just one quick question for you, Priyanka. So I know last year SPAG produced a report with the healthcare communications outlook. And I think it was a little bit more from the corporate sort of, broad scale governmental transformation perspective. And now obviously you've got one here looking at the investor startup side. So have you noticed some differences between the two in perspective there?
Yes and no. Of course, when we were doing last year, the annual report, this was mostly focused on the communicators. Those were in the region, the challenges that they used to face, the opportunities that they saw, and how they saw or envisaged the industry growing up in the next 10 years. Of course, from the investors' point of view, all of these communicators, whatever they were bringing along in terms of thoughts and processes, those were equally important. And I think that's the kind of understanding both sides. It's there. As I say, mostly it's obvious, it's considered as good to do, but how many people effectively do that is something which needs to be considered more often. The communication needs to be understood well. I think people usually misunderstand that the value of communication, what's the power of communication, how you can leverage it to build your brand. All of that is very inclusive to even building your company or an organization at multiple levels. So I think that's been there. It's high time that people have understood now, and all thanks to COVID-19, that people are kind of putting their head together on this front.
Cool. Okay, we're starting to get some questions coming in, but I think these questions will be good for a broader panel discussion. So before we get there, I'll just run the second poll here, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So let's see. Based on what you've heard Priyanka say, and everyone was optimistic at the beginning that they're going out for new markets and continuing their business strategies. So how have you felt about your prior interactions with investor groups? Does it go well? Does it not progress? Do you feel a challenge in conveying your value proposition? What's been people's experience so far? A few more seconds. All right. Yeah, so quite interesting, right? We had a pretty optimistic group at the beginning in terms of their business strategy and their attack on new markets, but then there seems to be a little bit of a hiccup here in terms of how they do communicate with investors. So I think that's a perfect platform for us to have a discussion. How can we overcome this hurdle? Okay, well, like I said, we've got prepared discussion prompts, but I'm very happy to just take the audience questions here. So we've got one that came in. It might be a little bit more for Priyanka and Grace, but obviously Sumant and Mervin, feel free to chime in. So question here is, basically, I think they've understood what you've said, Priyanka, about the different strategies for a successful communication plan, but how do you actually map out that journey? What are the platforms? What are the modalities that can, foster that discussion forward? Again, bearing in mind that most people seem to have had some issues with keeping discussions going with investors, right? So whoever wants to take that first, go ahead. Grace?
Should I take this up?
Okay. I can do it.
Go ahead, please.
Maybe I think the poll question or the poll responses earlier was quite interesting, right? Like, people actually find it difficult to connect with investors. And we often hear that investor and startup or founders relationship is almost like a marriage. We've heard it a few times, where, even if you were to go out dating, or meet somebody new for the first time, there are different ways that you want to be approaching that session. Do you want to talk about shared vision? Do you want to talk about shared interest? So I think that is always a good starting point, knowing and understanding what the investors are looking for, not just investors, but any potential partners or customers are looking for, and try and tailor your messaging accordingly. So I think one of the, I wouldn't call it the mistakes, but it's a learning point that a lot of startups go through, is that they have a pitch deck and they use it everywhere, which is great. But I think there is also a need to make sure that the pitch deck as well as communications is tailored according to the target audience that you're talking to. So I think back to the point about the different modalities or the platforms that you can use, I wouldn't say there is a one-size-fits all kind of approach. And Priyanka had actually mentioned a couple of channels that you can look at, like LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, for example, depending on your products and solutions. So the good thing about startup is that you're small, you're nimble, you are open to experimenting. So that is great. And personally, I think for me, I like to work on digital platforms because they give me the numbers and the data that I need. And they give me the insights into which are the most effective platforms in terms of getting the engagement, in terms of getting the calls and the emails that I want. And from there, then you can make the necessary tweaks along the way to make sure that you are adjusting your approach continuously. So I think along that journey, you have to make multiple adjustments to make sure that your communication method is the most effective. So I think that is just my perspective.
Thanks. Priyanka, you want to comment on that, or should I allow the investor gents to?
So no, I think what Grace actually said builds up most of the things that, just to take a synopsis on that, how do you leverage the relevant communication channels and mediums? That's very important. Adopting a messaging tonality unique to your business is important. Then again, how do you plan and have a balanced approach with the oral, the visuals, the written communications? All of these are very important. And then, of course, how do you create high quality content like opinion pieces, maybe say research reports, annual reports? I think you need to be choosy, and classy, if I were to put it, and wise when promoting your brand message through advertisement, content, or online promotion.
Thanks. Yeah, so let's turn it to the other side of the table now. So Mervin and Samant, you've heard communication strategy, you've heard startups maybe have some difficulty keeping discussions going with you. So how do you want to be reached? I mean, what has been your experience? There's a question that just came in. You know, how important is it to meet people in person versus right now it's a kind of digital format? So what are your thoughts on what you've heard so far today?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to go first. And again, thanks for inviting me to this panel. Just for everyone's benefit, my name is Mervin. I'm from Quadra Capital. We're a healthcare private equity firm. We invest across growth so as well as VC within healthcare in Asia. I think reacting to the earlier points around communications, at least from our experience as an investor, when we are sitting on the other side of the table, I think it's important, I think, to start with also shortlisting your audience, like who you're actually reaching out to, doing some research on, you know, the fund's investment mandate, past and current portfolio, to see if your company actually has some potential portfolio synergies that you can bring to the investor, right? So I think that will be important as a starting point, because you don't want to be wasting time on someone who's obviously not interested or will not invest. So I think that's one point. And second is, I know it almost sounds like common sense, but I think it's also important to identify if the person you're speaking to is the right person. But at least I have learned it the hard way when as a fund, we do fundraising ourselves as well. So we're actually pitching to institutional investors to invest in our fund. And sometimes you might think that you're talking to the right person for a few months and then realize later that, you know what, actually there's some other guy I should be talking to. So kind of understanding the firm and then who's the right people you're talking to, and is this the right firm that you think will invest? I think that saves you a lot of time when you actually go out fundraising. And the second point I wanted to highlight as well, and Priyanka, you covered this in your slides earlier, but I think it's probably not accentuated deep enough. I think one important point around what we look at in a company before we invest, well, the market opportunity is obvious, you know, company specific circumstances is important, but the single most important point for us, at least in emerging markets when we invest, is actually counterparty risk, right? So actually understanding who you're doing the business with, your relationship with the founder. And you know, what we learned is that issues that are hard and sometimes nearly impossible to circumvent are issues to do with emotion, and it's a relationship issue, and those are actually very hard issues to tackle. And you know, so I think when we make an investment into the founder and to the promoter, it's as much to do with chemistry as much as competency of the founder. So I think that is one element that we think about a lot. Like, unfortunately, it's one that's very hard for you when you speak to a founder to actually build that chemistry. But I think that there's actually a very important component that you should think about as you go out there to raise capital. Sorry, but I mean, on whether we need to meet a founder in person or virtually. And look, I think we are in the midst of doing deals right now when we can't travel. So I don't think it's a barrier. We could do a lot of the work online in terms of diligence, but I think philosophically, you know, we have to meet the founder in person before we write a check. But it's more philosophical than out of necessity.
Yeah, it's kind of, on one hand, there is unleashed potential for a startup to pitch to any investor anywhere seamlessly, conveniently, right? But I do think the dynamics of the interaction and the charisma, and as you said, being able to get a feel for who they are, not just what they're offering, that can be a bit more challenging now. So yeah, maybe Samant, you can comment on that, and feel free to explain a little bit about healthtech Capital too, if that's helpful for people.
Thank you, Chris. I think, so I'll start with healthtech. I'm the managing partner at healthtech Capital. It's a VC based out of Singapore, investing in healthcare innovations in the early stage. I think my view is when you're going to meet the investors, one part which is often overlooked is optimizing your pitch, which comprises of really, you know, it think of how it could be actually as short as possible, but yet containing all the key messages. So you hit swiftly and you hit hard, kind of a thing, rather than downloading a whole pot of, you know, data and information on the investor. Basically, that's what piques our interest. And once you've got a piqued interest, you can help double click the specific points which the investor needs. So you kind of, put a foot in the door, then you sort of open it, and then sort of go deeper into more specific vertical points. So, before you actually go meet your investors, I think it's very useful to have, what are the 5 or 6 things that I'm going to say today, right? And I'm putting it very simplistically, right? What are the 5 or 6 great hitting points for me, whether it's value prop, it's our technology, it's regulatory, et cetera, et cetera. The other is prep for FAQs, because those always those trick questions which are coming your way, but don't get caught off guard. So your pitch stays consistent and steady. You should be seeming in control, right? Matters a lot. So the moment you get ruffled, in this thing, that, well, as a founder, looks like he's not prepared enough, he's not thought enough. And you should be. I mean, that's a basic hygiene factor that I would imagine when I'm talking to a founder. He's covered all bases, right? I mean, he knows the answers and he's thought, not just to make an answer, to respond, basically. And third, which really matters towards the end, is, showing clarity of vision and the path forward. What do you have in mind? And that's where I think the nice, Grace mentioned that thing about investors and founders being like in a marriage. That's where the meeting of minds really happen. That, do we get sold on the story and the vision that you have? And do you see that clearly, by the way? It's one thing to see the vision, but do you see, how do you get that vision? And is it clear when you're actually speaking to us? So I think that part kind of seals it towards the end, help the investors see what you're seeing and how will you get there. I think when you're in with the investor, or at least getting in with the investor, I think very crucial part of communication between founder and the key person at an investor side is really transparency and directness. Goes a long way. And there is a fine balance that we look at between someone being flexible to hear, learn, and change versus someone who thinks himself and is a self-driver as well. So that's a very, very exquisite balance that one needs to find in founders. At least that's what we look for. Because if one is too flexible, then you have founders coming back more often than you'd like to get guidance, to get sort of directions almost. But that's not what sort of really drives us to look at. We really look at self-driven sort of founders who are passionate, who seem in control by themselves. But at the same time, being flexible. It's not like you block out whatever the investor says. You're willing to learn and change. So I think that must come forth more upfront, and that kind of matters. Of course, on the personal meeting side, I do believe, we are a business which is run by people. It's a people business. So meeting and charisma, as Chris said, all of it remains as important as it was. But given the changing times, I think a lot has been achieved by virtual sort of engagement. However, I think what we can do, and it's made the process more efficient, is you could actually take care of most of the engagement while you're pitching and going through this whole process of getting in fundraising. You could optimize this process a lot by virtual. But at the end, you will still probably need to do that personal thing to actually just tip the scales completely. So that's where the differences come pre-COVID, post-COVID. It was a lot of meeting initially, and then maybe a little bit interspersed virtual sort of engagements earlier. But that's kind of changed to a lot of virtual versus a little bit at the end to tip over kind of a thing. But it's encouraging to see that one can also do virtual DDs almost now, including looking at people sort of live videos with, let's say, a case study. If I invest in a hospital or some technology which is being deployed in a hospital, we just conducted our first virtual DD where somebody was actually videographing everything that happened from point to point. So it's possible, and it's happening now.
So to summarize, it's okay for the initial meetings that you wear your shorts to the pitch because it's just a video, but then later on you need to dress appropriately for the live meeting to seal the deal, right? That's the takeaway here. Okay, and again, please, guys, keep the questions coming from the audience. I think this session is for you, so you have a great opportunity here to hear from some great experts on the topic. Let's talk about, most people indicated they're either keeping their pre-COVID focus or trying to look into new markets, right? So let's maybe talk about pivots here. And I'd love to hear from you guys some examples you've already been seeing during COVID or as we kind of move into kind of recovery mode, either pivot of the strategy, right? So maybe it's the same value proposition, but looking at new markets, or maybe new value proposition, or it could be a pivot in communication strategy, right? So maybe it's the same value proposition, but you're trying to communicate it differently or to different sets of stakeholders, right? So I would love to know from you guys, have you seen some of this? What have been the good examples, maybe the not so good examples? Whoever wants to go first.
Mervin?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think in terms of communications, I think the messaging has been quite similar. I don't think COVID has changed much. Obviously, given us we're in healthcare, we are right in the thick of things. So I think what we are doing, at least as a firm, when talking to our investors and our portfolio companies, is keeping a more regular update beyond what we would usually do. I think global investors have tapered their expectations a little bit, not a little bit, but actually quite a bit with COVID-19, where, in the past was always about alpha and, getting top quartile returns. I think the reality is such in today's markets that they are more concerned with capital preservation. So making sure that you do not actually lose capital, I think that will be a priority for them. And then obviously, if you can maintain that and then create alpha as global economies recover, that will be great. So I think the ability to communicate the fact that, despite being a VC or a startup, the fact that, you have a strong pathway towards profitability, or you're actually able to leverage COVID-19 and the recovery that comes after, I think that is critical, right? The upside returns is great, but I think investors' expectations have also been moderated somewhat in current markets. At least that's what we have been seeing. I think the other trend that we have been seeing more in Asia is actually the focus around ESG and impact reporting. Our investors come from US and Europe, a lot of large pension funds and insurance companies and institutional investors, and there's an increasing push actually towards reporting ESG and impact performance on the companies that we manage. And given that we're in healthcare in emerging Asia, actually it's obvious for us on what we can report, but I think think through that element of reporting where you could communicate that your business is not just doing well, but it's also doing good. I think that could be an added advantage as you go out there and reach out to investors looking to invest in this part of the world.
Maybe let's throw it back to the communication side. So now we've had the investor, group talking for a while here. Priyanka, Grace, what's your reaction? And Grace, by the way, I probably should have let you in the beginning talk a little bit more about SG Innovate too, so feel free to explain some of that as well.
Yeah, so I probably should give a very short introduction about SG Innovate. So we are a Singapore government-backed VC. So we invest in deep technology startups. So a lot of the technology areas that we look at are in medical tech, artificial intelligence, quantum tech. Increasingly, we are also looking at agri-food tech and advanced manufacturing. So I think these are the main areas that we're looking at. And the startups that we invest in are primarily in the very early stage. So typically from the pre-seed to Series A stages. So I think that's what we do. And I lead communications for the company. So not just for the company, but also for our portfolio companies. In terms of giving them advice and counsel in terms of how they want to be approaching, their marketing, branding, or communication strategies. So that is something that we are working with them on. So currently we have 80 plus startups, firms within our portfolio. So it's impossible for us to cover all. So like what Mervin has mentioned, it's about prioritizing right now and working through with some of the startups that are currently facing challenges in different areas, be it through in terms of their development roadmap, in terms of, I think one of the main challenge that they have frequently raised up is actually getting in touch with potential investors as well as partners and customers, given the disruption in networking sessions, the disruption in having the opportunity to meet people face to face. So I think these are challenges they are facing, and for us, we're trying to find ways in which we can help to find new ways, or like what I've mentioned before, our panel, new virtual ways of getting these people still connected. So that's what we do at SGNB and what I do. So back to the original point about pivoting and shifting in a current landscape, there are a couple of portfolio companies within SGNB that has pivoted in terms of their business strategy. So I don't know whether you're familiar with Bioformis, Lucent, and Structal. So I think they're all medical technology health tech companies that were doing very well in their respective realms, but with the big hit from COVID-19, I think they've also pivoted the technology to meet some of the challenges that are being brought forth by the pandemic. So I think they're currently looking at ways in which they can diagnose COVID-19. They're looking at ways in which we can also monitor COVID-19 patients or potential COVID-19 patients through that technology. So I think they've done well in that realm. And in fact, I think Bioformis have recently raised the latest round, CEC. Was it last week or something? Yeah, so I think they did not have the intention to raise, but because of the opportunities that were, because of the exposure they've gotten and the opportunities that were being almost, they managed to capture the right opportunities, and then, therefore they had people knocking on their door. So I think that was a good example. And finally, to Mervin's point about doing good and doing things right, I think increasingly as consumers, right? So you're being more discerning. You're using a product and solution not because it serves your needs, but also because you believe in the brand or believe in the company that is producing these products and solutions. So so having that brand trust and having that that understanding with the consumer that I'm doing the right thing while I'm manufacturing, while I'm producing this technology is important. So with that alignment, I think it helps you to reach out to a wider group of audience, and people actually feel happy, they feel safe, they feel comforted that I've invested in your company or I'm purchasing your product. So I think that is an important point from a communications perspective. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Priyanka, would you like to add from your side?
I think it's mostly been covered, but so of course, taking on the mechanisms that a startup should focus on to improve the communication strategies and skills. I have always been a great believer that a big chunk of companies' reputation and image lies in how the enterprise communicates and expresses in its observations, ideas, and the knowledge to the external stakeholders. So I think that's very important. And then, of course, how a perfect communication strategy is managed with the external public just knows when to announce the right information and at the right time through the right channels. I think those are the three key things that if a startup follows, I think that's fairly taking care of majority of the communications aspect as well. So I think it broadly covers all of that. And then the expanding roles played by the press releases, as I said, the announcements, the release notes, the blogs, all forms of communications just add up to something to reckon with, especially when it comes to getting the apt message across to the people.
Great. Let's take another audience question here. So this one's a bit more on the medical technology side, not on the care delivery side, okay, for Mervin and Simon, because I know you have a kind of mixed portfolio. So, traditionally, I think in medtech, health tech, there's kind of this idea that if you're innovating something in Singapore, Asia, that your beachhead is going to be US or Europe because of price points and scalability, right? So do you see this changing in the current context? I mean, have you seen some other movements, or do you personally have an ambition to kind of do more inter-Asia work as well? Yeah, maybe Simon, since it's been a while since you talked.
Great question. Now, we are seeing sort of, we can actually see a pattern out here. I would say the healthcare companies which are more product oriented, which need a lot more credibility and clinical trials, clinical outcomes to be proven. A thing that we've seen, the pattern that we're seeing is Asia is a good place to actually start with doing that because you have more access to data, slightly relatively easier regulation, etc. And then once you sort of get a foothold out here, get some momentum in penetrating, let's say a couple of hospital systems or insurance companies, as clients, which would be just pilots or maybe just a small contract with an opt-in option to pay, that kind of a thing. That's the time when these product companies, that's as far as they sort of go initially in Asia. And then they start thinking, hey, how do I make it big here? The clients out here would probably have a restricted sort of ability to sign checks up to, let's say, a 50K or maybe 100K. But if you actually go to the client's headquarters, which are actually in the US, etc., then the check size is actually increased for the same amount of effort. So then the gradual realization comes that, all right, maybe we need to sort of go there. But again, the caveat is, if it's a product, does it actually, is it applicable in this side of the markets, emerging Asia? And if it's applicable, is it scalable in these markets? Now, the trouble with Southeast Asia, each country is very different as a market. And therefore, it has been challenging in scaling what are medtech or products, etc., which need the traditional sort of sales cycles to go through in clients, which are typically, let's say, hospitals or distributors and so on and so forth. So better bang for buck. That's why people, then start going to the other side, which is in the Western markets. However, a much more efficient and exciting play which is happening in emerging Asia are the space of, let's say, e-commerce, online aggregator of healthcare services, which are actually technology enabling access, affordability kind of play. Those are extremely exciting. I mean, for example, if I were to, there's an exciting startup in India which is aggregated daycare surgeries, which are completely elective surgeries done during the day. You're gone after the surgery. All they do is aggregate that, get consumers, surgeons, and infrastructure, which is out there, but not being utilized properly. So improve utilizations, reduce cost, increase revenues and number of patients for the surgeons. Everybody wins and goes home happy. So it's a latent need. It is efficiencies that you're bringing in. And why can't you scale this? Because it's bringing down the cost for the end consumer. Similarly, a B2B distribution consolidator or aggregator in Vietnam for pharmacies. A very interesting place because it's very messy in terms of distribution in Vietnam, right? You've got like all of those hierarchies from key distributors, the MNC distributors, to wholesalers, to, multiple agents in between. So there are layers and layers, and somebody who can cut through this is consolidating the market, then why not? These examples can scale very well in emerging Asia. So it's that's how it would depend on which battles as investors we pick. If you're backing a product, then you should be looking at a two-pronged kind of a strategy. One last point that I'm making is an example. For example, we invest in a point-of-care diagnostic, but there were 2 point-of-care diagnostics. One was towards diabetes and cardiac, which was very applicable to Asia. But we also invested that while this will be a hard climb, organic sort of scale up in Asia, because of the reasons I mentioned, the other part would be they had a heart failure point of care diagnostic meant for the US markets. And heart failure is huge in US. So you would want to look at sort of a two-pronged strategy that applicability should be there either at both ends if you're looking at products.
Yeah, thanks, Samant. And usually what I try and inform people as well is there are, equally, if not greater opportunities within Asia. It just requires different mentality of how you're going to market and what you're offering. And I think increasingly transparency around reference pricing will come to haunt those who are trying to kind of just play the pricing game, right? So there's a good feedback. I want to get to one other question in the chat, but maybe Mervyn, just some quick comment on this question too, if you have any.
Yeah, sure, just very quickly. I think there are very few medtech businesses in Asia, and when I say Asia, I mean ex-Japan, China, Korea, that are really global in nature. If you look at it, perhaps maybe only the glove sector in Malaysia that arguably is global in nature, but there are very few medtech businesses that are truly global in this part of the world. I think we as a firm fundamentally believe that the center of gravity for healthcare is shifting rapidly from the west to the east. Whichever metric you look at, whether it's growth and size, and in about 10 years time, for example, the healthcare sector in Asia is going to be larger than the US and Europe combined today. So that's just the size of the opportunity. And in fact, we're seeing global majors actually pivoting their businesses towards Asia, right? So we think that the opportunity is here in this part of the world. Companies that we see are successful are actually providing localized solutions, leveraging cost advantages that Asia has, availability of scientific talent, and the large patient pool, that there's a need for lower cost solutions. So I think the businesses, at least we've seen successful, are really focused on providing localized solutions rather than trying to build a global business out of emerging Asia.
Thanks, Mervyn. Plus, the other benefit is you don't have to wake up in the middle of the night to do your virtual pitching, so that also helps. Okay, I think here's a good question for Grace and Priyanka. So, in the sense that a startup might have a delay in, getting to market, or let's say approvals or product development, how do you think they should be communicating that to investors?
Grace, take it up.
Me? Okay.
Sure.
Yep.
Well, I think that there should be mutual understanding, right? I mean, this COVID-19 situation has hit businesses, not just startups, but large corporates as well. So I think as long as a startup or the founders are able to show a plan of how they are trying to mitigate through this crisis, be it through the continuation for the technology in terms of the technology roadmap, or how they are looking at preserving their capital, for example, would be important information that they should share with the investors, essentially to show confidence that they know exactly what I'm doing. I know that I'm facing all these problems, I'm facing all these challenges, but these are the steps that we will be taking to address all these challenges. So I think that having that transparent as well as very clear conversation with the investors would be important. Yeah.
Priyanka, how about you?
I agree completely with what Grace just said. Of course, we all need to be aware that COVID-19 is here to stay for a while, if not longer. And how do you not only mitigate it, but manage your communications, manage your brand, make it more sustainable, viable, agile, adaptive. I think those are the key words that everyone needs to understand. And when you're reaching out to the investors, be open, show that it's scalable. It's what's the opportunity that your product is bringing in the market. What is the is it able to match up to the competition already being there? So I think all of those things, and the story that you present to the investor, that's very important. And I mean, it's about how you build it up completely.
Yeah, I think there's a high level of understanding and empathy right now. We're all kind of in this together. Everyone's trying to make their impact out there. So probably the worst thing you could do would be to hide it or mislead on what is your roadmap strategy, right? It's about being transparent and working on it together. So, all right, one final question for all of you, and then we'll wrap up here. So if you had to give kind of one recommendation, so, a lot of startups on the phone today and other sort of entrepreneurs, obviously a high degree of interest in having better investor discussions, finding new market opportunities. So within the realm of communications, what is your kind of one recommendation for these players? Is there somewhere they can go to upskill, or do you just have one kind of final word of wisdom here, specifically on the communication side? So Priyanka, how about you?
There are a few, actually, if I can put that across, but some things I think to keep in mind when communicating about your product would be tell a story. I think all entrepreneurs have a story. They should be able to they should not underestimate their story, first of all, and they should be able to tell it in a more exciting and ensure that it aligns to everybody's goals and purpose. Secondly, I think is the branding part. So how do you brand yourself? It's very important, and I have been emphasizing on that where well enough. Third, of course, how do you make your message simple, sophisticated? I think that's very important as well, because your audience needs to understand what you are doing regardless of your background. So I think that's there. Then, of course, following the trends that serve your mission. So I think that, and then how do you maintain an open communication channel between yourself and your stakeholders? I think those are the few key things to keep in mind when you are developing your communication strategy and plan.
Okay, Grace, how about you?
I think maybe just 2 points. I think for a start, the startups, when you're looking at offering their new products in the market, they should understand who they're talking to, whether there is an unmet need for solution that they're offering, whether there are existing competitors already in the market, and what are they saying in the market. And I guess most importantly, they should be clear of their value proposition, because that would be very important for them to cut through the noise and get their messages out. So I think that is the first part. And maybe the second part is on impact and staying true to their purpose, because I think the fundamental of effective communications is it's important, it's essential, but keeping that aligned with your key purpose, what your brand, what your company stands for, will really help to tell good quality and very convincing stories. So I think these are the 2 points that they should bear in mind.
Right. I think between both of you, I'm hearing a lot of the storytelling capability. Which
It's always about storytelling, right? But it has to be transparent. It has to be truth. It has to be truthful. So I think these are
and I think targeted
components.
I think that's also very important
of good communications. Yeah.
Sometimes storytelling can be hard. Okay, and Mervin and Simon, sorry, just in the essence of time, probably you have to give one thing. So you have to one word of wisdom here. Mervin, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think Priyanka and Grace covered the communications aspect. I think I would just like to maybe offer some words of encouragement for those of you in your journey of fundraising, is to be relentless. I think COVID-19 is an unprecedented event, but we, as investors in the market, we also see bear markets as an opportunity to buy. So there's capital out there, substantial capital out there to invest. So while the journey might seem hard, I think this is also a good opportunity to actually raise capital. So best of luck to all of you on the call who are actually in that part of the journey right now.
Thanks, Mervin.
And I think if I can add to what Mervin just said, it's not only hard for the startups, it's equally hard for the investors as of now. They're all trying to figure out what's best possible. So we're all in the storm, we're all trying to figure out. That's how it is.
I'll just add to that. I think there's one subtle nuance that as founders you could sort of double click on, which is when you're going out there and speaking to an investor, your own positioning should, by the way, be that you're convinced of your own value prop, obviously. But at the same time, whilst you've pitched to an investor, it should stop just short of, appearing salesy and very pushy. It should be more in terms of you've shared a certain piece of information, and you're not asking for an investment. And that when that happens, we would see, on the other hand, somebody who's in control and values his own sort of startup and believes in it, and that sort of pushes up the points for the founder assessment itself, and how carefully he views the value that he's carrying with his company. So that's one. And just the last one would be, I think, which something that I used in my consulting days, which is, look at the share of voice that's out there in the market in your space, and make sure very meticulously, mechanically, that the share of voice that you have out there vis-a-vis your immediate competition is actually dominant, and track that make sure and you go about it in such a way that you engineer that your voice is actually heard. The right voice is, of course, be the thought leader in that. And that intangibly basically comes back, the investor's already read about you, knows about you, and so on, and do so sort of on a periodic and as per a plan for comms and sort of track that. So that would help you out intangibly while you do direct sort of engagements with investors.
Great. Well, many thanks all. I'm going to try and wrap this up here. So just we're almost done, a couple more minutes. First of all, many thanks to APACMed and the Founders Series and to our speakers and panelists for taking the time. I hope those of you in the audience learned and had the opportunity to engage. So thanks for joining. At the beginning, I said the goal here today is to talk about the continued opportunity for impact of innovation out there, but equally the important role of communications as it evolves and under these new circumstances. So I kind of took away three things from today. One is what I would call digital, or there was still a need for digital interaction, but ultimately it does come down to some level of physical interaction as well. So we need to bear that in mind. Secondly, it's clear and consistent storytelling, even if that means you are on a delay. You just need to be clear and consistent about your roadmap. And thirdly, I thought it was great we talked about ESG, and I think this is a reflection that all of us are having now, is just the impact we're trying to make on the world. So thank you guys for sharing. I'm just going to quickly launch the last poll here just because I'm very interested in it. So let's see, we'll do it very quickly, see what people have to say. So now that you've heard from all of this today, what is your business strategy? Are you still going for a kind of corporate investor route, maybe looking more the institutional route, or you are just going to create your own market?
Valid, I love the third option.
Easy to say, hard to do. Okay, 5 more seconds. It's a pretty overwhelming response here, though. All right, so Simant, Mervin, I think you'll be getting a lot of people chasing you after this. And Grace, yeah, so look out for your inbox. I think people are convinced you guys are the channel. So, all right, Gabriel, Priyanka, back over to you guys to close things out here.
Okay.
Thank
Yep.
you
So,
a lot, Chris.
yeah, thank you, Chris, Priyanka, Seeman, Grace, and Mervin. Appreciate your time. So just some comments from my end as well. I think as Mervin has mentioned, fundraising without meeting face-to-face is really the new norm in a post-COVID-19 world. And I think, again, a few takeaways, we've heard from the panelists on how to tell our stories effectively, specifically the startups. And also active and transparent communication is very important, more important than ever before, especially when we operate virtually. And last but not least, I think we should look at our communication strategy. Our voice should lead to increase, credibility, which is our value, and ultimately, fundability. So with that, once again, thank you to all the panelists, who are with us today, and attendees who have joined us today. And I wish you a very good rest of the week, and look forward to having you with us at the next APACMed Founder Series webinar. Thank you, and have a good rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Priyanka.